Good morning. It's good to see you this morning. It's always good to have visitors with us. I'm going to do something a little bit different this morning. I'm going to stand down here this morning because I want us to visualize something together. I found that we are creatures that really like visuals in order to learn. And that's why we do sometimes the PowerPoint on the screen behind me, and that's helpful in our learning process. I find that if we can just sort of think in our minds about something that maybe is not there in reality, in our mind's eye, we can see it as though it was there. And so that's what we're going to do this morning. We're going to imagine something is here that is not really here. Okay, that'll make more sense to you in just a moment. I do hope that you have your Bible and you'll open it to the book of Micah, chapter 6. Micah, chapter 6, and the outline for our study will come from Micah, chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. Micah 6, verses 1 through 8. I want us to visualize that we've just entered a courtroom together. All of you that are sitting in the pews this morning, you have come to be witnesses of this particular occasion. You've not been subpoenaed to this event, but you knew about the trial. It's the trial, we'll call it the trial of the decade. It's a little more significant than that, but it's a big trial. And you've heard about it, you have seen the advertisements about it, you have been interested in seeing it up close and personal, and you just happened to get a ticket to get into the courtroom in order to watch this trial in person. And so you have come to be a witness. Now, as you come in as a witness to this trial, you look on the stage immediately behind me, and we're going to allow the pulpit area to be where the judge sits. And then we're going to imagine that right over in this area here, there you have the plaintiff, and then right over in this area here, you have the defendant. Now, I've not talked with any attorneys before this, so I don't know if I've got that right or wrong, but just go with me on this. So the plaintiff sits here, the defendant here. And I've not watched enough, legal show. I've watched a lot, but not enough in paying attention as to who sits where. But plaintiff, defendant. It's a little bit of a unique situation because the judge in this particular case is not only the judge, but the judge is also the plaintiff. And so we've got an odd situation. You say, well, what is your role in this? Well, I'm the court reporter. I'm going to be the court reporter, the court commentator in this situation. And so my job then is going to be doing some reading and then making some observations from the text as we go along through this process together. So we're looking, and there is the judge. Here is the plaintiff, and here are the defendants. And I say defendants, plural, because it's not just one individual, but it is a multitude of folks. I mean, we've got a large crowd here. We say, well, who are the defendants? Who's the plaintiff? Who's the judge? God's the judge. God's the plaintiff. Israel, really Israel and Judah, but in particular, Israel is going to be the defendant. Now, it's important when you have a case to understand that, generally speaking, you will have witnesses that will come into the courtroom. This courtroom is a little unique in the sense that this courtroom is outside. And so we're imagining once again, we're seeing this visually, we're seeing Israel, we're seeing the plaintiff, which is God, we're seeing God as a judge, and isn't it good that God can be in two places at once because He is omnipresent? And so we're seeing God, we're seeing Israel as the defendant, but we're outside. And it's a good thing that we're outside because as we're outside, we need to see the witnesses who have been subpoenaed for this particular trial. And the witnesses that have been subpoenaed for this particular trial are the mountains and the hills. And so the mountains that are reaching up to the heavens, we might say, and then the hills that represent this rock-solid foundation of the earth. And in Jewish law or Hebrew law, what we would find is that it was a requirement to have at least two witnesses for something to be so or proven. And so God, the plaintiff, He has, the judge and the plaintiff in particular in this part, He has called to witness this particular occasion and history, the mountains and the hills. And so we read together in Micah chapter 6. In Micah chapter 6, beginning with verse 1, the Bible says, "Hear ye now what the Lord saith. Arise, contend thou before the mountains, and let the hills hear thy voice. Hear ye, O mountains, the Lord's controversy, and ye strong foundations of the earth. For the Lord hath controversy with his people, and he will plead with Israel. O my people, have I done unto thee? And wherein have I wearied thee? Testify against me. For I brought thee up out of the land of Egypt, and redeemed thee of the house of the servants. And I sent before thee Moses, and Aaron, and Miriam. O my people, remember now that Balak king of Moab consulted, and when Balak the son of Beor answered him from Shittim unto Gilgal, that ye may know the righteousness of the Lord. And so we have the case stated. The spokesman for the plaintiff, God being the plaintiff, and the spokesman for the defendants, Israel being the defendants, are one and the same, which is a very interesting thing. And so God is judge and God is plaintiff. He has a spokesperson. He has an attorney, if you please. The attorney that he has hired is the country prophet Micah. The same hired attorney is representing the defendants. It's rather unusual, isn't it? But here the country prophet Micah, in representing both folks, he's representing Israel and he's representing Judah, who are living prior to the Assyrian siege of the northern kingdom of Israel. And what God has done through the process leading up to that particular siege of Assyria is He has warned His people, but they have not listened. They have not heeded the warning, and as a result of not heeding the warning, they are going to be conquered, and later would come Judah as well in 606. And so as we think about this particular case, and that's what we're going to call our first point, simply the case, verses 1 through 5, I want us to observe that the mountains and the hills are witnesses to all that God has done. I mean, the mountains and the hills, they've been around for, well, forever, if you will. Now, we might argue that the mountains were not the mountains as you and I normally think of them as being mountains until post-flood, because when the flood came in, it just revolutionized the way the earth looked. But we're just going to say that the mountains have been around forever. The hills have been around forever. They have seen God's work from the beginning of their creation, and my, what they have witnessed. They have witnessed the glory of the Almighty. They have witnessed the protection and the care of God. They have watched as God's people have made one blunder after another after another. And yet God's mercy and His love and His kindness have continued to exist, and the mountains and the hills were witnesses to this fact. Now, isn't it the case sometimes that we become a little bit negligent in our perception of God? And we say, woe is me. When has God remembered me? When has God thought positively about me? When has God done something good about me? Because all we're doing is we're focusing on all of the negativity in our lives. It happens to us all at one time or another. And so what God is doing before Israel, the defendants, is He is calling to their remembrance by use of the witnesses that have been around forever to say, God is taking care of you. God has given you far beyond your needs, but He's given many of your wants. Take note. And then as we continue here in our observation, my people, what have I done? How have I wearied you? What have I done that you would stand here in this box as a defendant and you would make charge against me for anything amiss? Have I not cared for you? Have I not provided for you? Have I not taken care of your needs? How have I wearied you? Verse 4, did I not bring you out of the land of Egypt? Now mind you, this is the prophet. This is Micah. And Micah is taking the defendants as he's speaking for God. He's taking the defendants, who he will represent in a moment, and he'll say, don't you remember back all those years ago? when you had been taken over by that wicked Pharaoh who refused to recognize the God of Joseph? Don't you remember that? Don't you remember how that you were in this bondage in Egypt and how you were captives and how you were hindered and how you were abused and how you were kept from even fully worshiping your God? Don't you remember the horrible situation that you were in? You remember who brought you out of that? You remember who raised up the deliverer for you? You remember who it was that caused you to be removed from the shackles, if you please, of Pharaoh and make your way out of bondage over ultimately into the promised land? Do you remember that? Do you remember whenever you were fleeing away from Pharaoh and you get there to the Red Sea and you know that you've got those soldiers behind you and God parts the Red Sea, He allows you to pass through, some estimates about 2 million of you. You pass through and then He allows that water to come back and He drowns the enemy, the Egyptians. You remember that? Remember when you got down to the mountain and I gave you a law so that you would know how to serve me adequately, so that you would know your responsibility to me and, by the way, what I would do for you? And remember how I gave you food to eat and water to drink? Do you remember that even in the face of your murmuring, and yes, you wandered the wilderness for 40 years, but do you remember the fact that I still allowed you, your people, to come into the promised land? Don't you remember? And as we continue to look at this text there in verse number 5, I redeemed you out of the house of servants, and I sent before you that leader, Moses. Remember? Remember how I sent Aaron to you? Now, who was Aaron? Do you remember how Aaron represented the holiness of God and how he is the one who made the spiritual connection, if you will, between you and God? You remember that? Remember Miriam, the prophetess? A spokesperson, if you please, for God, who gave you guidance and direction. I gave you everything you need. I gave you deliverance. I gave you a leader. I gave you spiritual guidance. I gave you someone who would testify of my word. I gave and I gave and I gave and I gave. What in the world are we doing here in court? We look at the next verse, verse 5. My people, remember now what Balak king of Moab consulted and what Balaam the son of Beor answered him from Shittim until Gilgal. Shittim would be the last place that they would camp on the east side of the Jordan before going in and conquering the land. Recall? Here they are, they're on the opposite side of the Jordan, they're on the east side of Jordan, they're looking over to the promised land, and they're looking at the victories that are before them. And yes, victories before them because God promised through Joshua, you're going to conquer the land. In fact, when you look at Joshua chapters 4 and chapter 6, the wording that's used there, it's as though the land had already been conquered. Because in God's eyes it had been. It had already been delivered into their hands. And then Gilgal would be the first place that they would camp on the west side of the Jordan before going in and conquering the land. God says, I gave and I gave and I gave. And I did this so that you may know the righteousness of the Lord. By the way, that phrase is only used one other time in the Bible. The righteousness of the Lord. That exact phrase. God's point is, I'm always going to do the right thing. I'm always going to do right by you. I'm never going to mislead you. I'm never going to deceive you. I'm never going to cause you harm. I'm always going to do right by you. And yet here we are. We're in court. That's the case. I want us to think about the conflict now in the next verse. The conflict. By conflict, I mean that we've got a conflict of the heart going on here. A conflict within the heart of the defendants. And so our representative over here, our attorney, and I don't even know if this is legal, by the way, but we've got our attorney over here for the plaintiff, and now the attorney's going to shift gears over here and is going to represent the defendant. In verse number 6, the Bible says, "Wherewith shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before Him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased?" Again, this is Micah speaking on behalf of the defendants. "Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams or with 10,000s of rivers of oil?" Now, just think about this for a moment. Sacrifice was a part of the old law, correct? I mean, this was normal. And they were saying, shall I come before God by sacrificing all of these animals? Were they supposed to sacrifice animals? Yes. But we're having an incredible amount of animals being talked about here for the purpose of sacrifice. Now, there's some who would think that this is a representation of perhaps all of Israel, not just individuals within the Israel camp, but all of Israel repenting and getting right with God. I don't believe that's what this is talking about here. Really what I think it's talking about is it's kind of like, well, God, do you want me to do something that's just impossible? Do you really want me to sacrifice all of these animals? Yes, I'll sacrifice, but all of this is ridiculous. Are you really asking me to do this? It makes no sense. And the reason I'm saying that is because of what takes place next. Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression? Whoa. Shall I kill my firstborn child for our transgression? Should I put to death my kid for our transgression? This probably wouldn't have sounded quite as bad then as it does now. But the point is, they have adopted so much idol worship because of the nations around them. They may have gotten this from the Moabites or the Phoenicians, in which they would actually sacrifice their children to the gods. Will that do it for you, God? Will that solve the problem? I mean, if we sacrifice an insane amount of animals, or maybe even our own kid, our own children, our firstborn, if we'll do that for you, Lord, will that satisfy you? Can we call it even at that point? Everything be good then? Look at the next part of the verse. The fruit of my body for the sin of my soul, verse 8. He has showed thee, O man, what is good. Uh-oh. We switch gears at this point. We've got the case, we've got the situation. We've got the conflict of heart within the defendants. God, are you going to be satisfied if we do all of this stuff? I mean, it's really the dotting the I's and the crossing the T's and that sort of thing, and that's what you're all about, isn't it, God? In verse number 8, we've got what I call the Christ. Now, this is not a reference to Jesus, but it is definitely a representation of the heart of Jesus. We spent a lot of time preaching lessons from the Gospels recently. Focused a lot of attention on Jesus, the heart of Jesus, our relationship to Jesus, living more like Jesus. And so it was interesting to me as I was studying this to say, verse number 8 is the heart of Jesus. And so we're going to call this the Christ. He has showed thee, O man, what is good. What did they say here? You remember? Should we crucify, kill all these animals? Shall we kill our firstborn? Will that do it? Jesus never left us guessing as to what was acceptable. You remember Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount? Jesus tells us what it is that He expects. God tells us what it is that He expects. He told them what He expected. There is no question. You go back to the Levitical law and you look at the book of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy in particular, where God sort of just lays out His law. And He tells them His exact expectations. There should have been no question in their mind what God expected from them to be right. And so Micah says, on behalf of the plaintiff again, He has showed thee, O man, what is good. And what doth the Lord require of thee? That, by the way, is man's greatest question. What does God require of me? Is it more than what I can do? I think some folks would try to get us to believe that to be the case. God requires this, this, and this. And sometimes this, and this is the Jewish hedge around the Torah. It's not really what God said He wanted. It's just what we said that God said that He wanted. So what does God require? Does He require us to kill our firstborn? Does He require us to give this ridiculous amount of sacrifices? What does He require? He tells us, do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with thy God. That'll do it for God. That's it. That's all God expected of them then. That's all God expects of us now. To do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. Did you get that? I mean, this is what they needed to get a hold of, right? What does God require? He only requires these things. Well, what exactly are these three things that He's talking about? Do justly. Do what's right. Just do what's right. That's what justly means. Just do the right thing. Obey the law. Don't steal from your employer. Don't cheat on your spouse. You see, the Bible is very clear on the things that God expects from us, and He just sort of writes them down for us in His text, and that's doing justly. Just do the right thing. Really, that's pretty easy. And most of us can get that. We understand it. It's that next piece that's a little bit of a struggle for us. Do justly and love mercy. In the Hebrew, that expression, love mercy, is about as close as you can get to the Greek agape. The idea of loving mercy is loving with no strings attached. That's agape. Loving, sacrifice with the expectation of anything in return. So what does it mean to love mercy? You see, this is where we get to the matter of the heart. I can do the right thing all day long. But yet I can have a rotten attitude in doing it. Right? I can obey the law. I can not cheat on my taxes. I can drive the speed limit, not run a stop sign. I can do all of these things according to the law, but when I'm out on 75 heading south into Atlanta, trying to obey the law and go the speed limit, and somebody cuts me off, I can really give them a piece of my mind. Well, I've done justly, but I haven't loved mercy, right? That's the piece that's a struggle for us. This is where, in the Spirit of Jesus, God steps it up a notch, if you will, if we can use that language. Law, got to do it. But you have to have the right spirit as well. And then, walk humbly with thy God. Literally, bow below to walk with God. That's tough. Especially in our country. I don't bow to anybody. I'm my own boss. I don't answer to anyone but me. Walk humbly. Put yourself under. Bow to walk below and do it with God. You see, He builds one on top of the other. You can love mercy without doing justice. I can feed the poor. I can take $1 million and feed thousands of people, right? Maybe I can do that as an individual. I can't, but maybe you could do that as an individual Christian. You can take $1 million and you can feed thousands of folks that are hungry. But maybe you stole that $1 million. Oh, you've got the right spirit. You're helping those in need. But you stole the $1 million. You violated the justice part. Or I can do justice. I can go earn a living and I can make money and I can come by that money honestly, but I can do zero to help those in need. That's not the right spirit, right attitude. So you see, we can do one of these without the other. Why, I can even, in words, walk humbly with my God, but not do justice, not love mercy, but I can claim to be just as much a Christian as anybody else. You see how we might claim to do one without the other, but really, it's all of it. How are you doing with that, defendants? Guilty, not guilty? Let's call out to the witnesses, the mountains and the hills, and they've been watching all of these years. They've watched God's people grow up. How are they doing? Guilty. Now, we all came into this courtroom. We got the ticket. We came into the courtroom. We were hoping to see a show. We knew God was going to be the judge and the plaintiff. And we knew Israel, they were going to be the defendants. And Micah, he was an incredible attorney from the country, and he was going to kind of work both sides of this situation. And we knew this was going to be a show. And we were going to watch with glee as God really put the hammer down on Israel and just sent them all off to prison. Guilty, not guilty? Guilty. What about the rest of us? We've come into the courtroom. We're not on trial, not in this trial, but we're on trial before God. How are we doing? Just sort of check in for a second and ask yourself that question. How am I doing? Am I doing justly? Probably. There may be some areas that I need to work on a little bit. Are you loving mercy? What's your heart like? Do you have a Jesus heart? That's what Paul was talking about in Philippians 2, the heart of a servant. What's your heart like? Are you bowing yourself low to walk with God? Are you walking humbly with God? Everything you do in life is about pleasing God. I can't answer these questions for you, and you can't answer the questions for me. But I hope that you'll answer them honestly. I'm going to stand and sing a song that's designed to encourage us to respond to the invitation if we need to. Generally, we think of the invitation as inviting people to come and to be baptized for the remission of their sins, and that's certainly a good thing, and if we want to go to heaven, then we need to do that. We don't always utilize the invitation in some of the other areas that we should, like maybe I'm struggling a little bit in my life and I need some help, and so I want to go and ask for prayers. So we invite you to do that as well. But maybe it's the case that you're a Christian. But you've been watching this trial, and you've been putting yourself in this box, and you've been thinking, if I were there with them, I'd be just as guilty. I haven't been walking justly and loving mercy, walking humbly. I haven't been doing those things, and so I'm guilty. I need to make some corrections in my life, and I'm ready to ask God to forgive. And I need to ask my brethren to forgive me, maybe, and we'll pray with and for you. If you need to respond to the invitation, we're going to invite you to do so. Just come down to one of these aisles, and the elders are going to be here. You can give them your hand and God your heart and your life, but do it now. As together we stand and as we sing.